Wyoming Territory, July 1883. The heat rose off the dry red earth like breath from a dying thing. But it was the sound, not the heat, that stopped Wade Ellery in his tracks. It was a baby's cry, thin and raw, cutting through the wind behind the old trading post like a blade. He had only ridden into the tiny outpost of Bitter Creek for supplies, flour, bullets, maybe a new tin coffee pot, but that sound froze him. He dismounted, boots hitting the dust, and followed the sound past the stacked crates and barrels behind the sun-faded building. Then he saw her. She was chained an iron cuff around one wrist, the chain bolted to a post buried in the ground. Her dress was torn, blood dried on the sleeve. Her hair was tangled, mouth cracked from thirst, but it was her eyes that held him still, fierce. Scared, tired, protective. She was cradling a baby girl barely a year old, maybe less, against her chest, the child's cheeks flushed from heat and crying. "Don't come closer," the woman said, lifting her chin. Her voice was hoarse but strong. Wade raised both hands, stepping slow. "I will not hurt you." She looked him over his trail-dusted clothes, the rifle across his back, the way he did not reach for it. "Who chained you?" he asked, his voice calm like he was speaking to a wild horse. Her jaw tightened. "Man who runs this post. Said I owed him. I do not. He took me in after I escaped. Somewhere worse. Then he locked me up, said I would work till I paid off my debt." She looked down at the baby and shifted the child gently. "Then he said I was worth more like this." Wade's stomach turned cold. "How long?" "5 days. Her eyes flicked to the door. "He takes the baby inside at night, keeps her from me." Wade's throat worked. "What is your name?" She hesitated. Selah Price." Wade nodded slowly, stepping closer. "Mine's Wade Ellery." "I am going to get you out." "You cannot." Her voice cracked then for the first time. "He owns the sheriff. No one helps. I am not no one." Something in his tone made her blink. Wade crouched near the post, eyeing the bolt. It was old, rusted, hammered into the packed dirt and wood. He stood and looked back at her. "Where is he now?" "Inside. Passed out drunk. He drinks after he locks the front every afternoon." Wade turned and walked back around the building. His heart was kicking in his chest now, not from fear but fury. He opened the door and took 2 steps in before the stink of sweat and whiskey hit him. The man behind the counter was slumped in a chair, bottle in hand, snoring. Wade walked to the back room. There, in a broken cradle, lay the baby, her face blotchy with tears, but her tiny fingers still curled and strong. He lifted her gently, tucked her against his chest, and walked out. When he stepped around the building again, Selah gasped and reached for them. Her hands trembled as she took the baby back, pressing her lips to the child's forehead again and again, whispering her name. "Vera," she breathed. "Her name is Vera." Wade did not say anything. He dropped to his knee and pulled a knife from his boot. He shoved it under the bolt, braced the handle, and drove it in hard. The bolt groaned but stayed. He leaned all his weight into it, gritting his teeth, pushing until the post cracked and the whole rig gave way. Selah gasped as the chain fell slack. He stood, breathing hard, and looked her in the eye. "You're free now." She stared at him, stunned. Then her knees buckled. Wade caught her before she hit the dirt, cradling both mother and child in his arms. Her shoulders shook once, a sob escaping her throat before she forced it back. "I can walk," she whispered. "I know," he said, but he did not let go. He carried her to his horse, helped her up, then climbed behind her. The baby was quiet now, tucked between them as they rode out of Bitter Creek before the sun dipped too low. They rode west, toward the foothills. Toward water, toward safety. It was not until they made camp by a creek that Selah spoke again. "Why did you help me?" Wade looked across the fire at her, the baby asleep in her lap. "Because I could not ride away and live with myself." She stared at him for a long time, Then she nodded once. "I do not know how to thank you," he met her eyes. "You just did." She lowered her gaze, running her hand gently over Vera's hair. "I do not know where to go." "You do not have to figure that out tonight." She looked up at him again. "Where are you going?" Wade tilted his head. "Was heading toward Jackson. Got enough land there for a horse or two. Cabin I built myself." Selah considered his words, her brow furrowed. "Do you live alone?" "I do." Silence stretched between them. "You can come with me," Wade said quietly, "if you want." She did not answer right away. But she did not turn away. Later, after Vera was wrapped in a blanket and sleeping soundly, Selah sat beside him by the fire. "You were the first person to ask my name in weeks," she said. Wade looked at her profile in the firelight, how her jaw had softened, how her shoulders no longer curled inward. "You were the first to say mine in months," he replied. Selah smiled faintly. Then, without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. Wade stilled, then wrapped his fingers around hers. They sat like that a long time, listening to the night sounds. Neither of them let go. By the second morning, Selah was walking on her own again. Her steps were slow, but steady, and she held Vera with a kind of practiced care that made Wade realize she'd been a mother longer than he'd first guessed. She didn't speak much after breakfast, but her silence was no longer guarded, just thoughtful. Wade packed up the bedrolls while she rinsed the tin cups in the creek, her skirt hem damp with dew. Vera was content in a sling Selah had tied from a strip of muslin she'd kept in the folds of her dress. The child stared up at the trees like they were something holy. "You ride in front today," Wade said, adjusting the saddle cinch. Selah glanced at him, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Is that offer still good? Heading toward Jackson?" He gave a single nod. "Nothing's changed." She climbed into the saddle with care, settling Vera against her chest. Wade mounted behind, and they continued west, following the edge of the hills where the grass grew in patches between granite outcrops. The country was quiet, save the wind threading through cottonwoods and the occasional far-off keening of hawks. Around midday, they passed an abandoned line camp, 2 broken corrals, and the frame of a roofless shack. Selah turned her head slightly. "You ever work cattle?" "A few years," Wade said, "before the land war near Laramie. Lost most of the herd and one brother to it." She didn't press him, but her voice softened. "Was it just the 2 of you?" "3. Older sister too. She married a riverboat captain back east. Haven't seen her since '79. Selah adjusted Vera's sling, shielding the child's face from the sun with her shawl. "I had a sister once, just younger than me, died in childbirth outside of Fort Kearney. Her husband was a teamster, drank too hard. Didn't bring the doctor fast enough." Wade didn't speak, but his hand moved to steady the reins where they crossed in front of her, a quiet gesture. They stopped in a shallow ravine as the heat peaked, making camp beneath a bluff that threw a sliver of shade. Selah laid Vera down on a blanket and took out a small wooden spoon from her satchel. She fed the child from a pouch of mashed beans Wade had packed, coaxing with soft clicks of her tongue. Wade leaned on his elbow nearby, watching the way Vera gripped her mother's finger between bites. "She takes after you," he said. Selah raised an eyebrow. "You think so? She's got your eyes. Same look when she's sizing things up." Selah laughed under her breath, not quite a full laugh, but the first sound close to it since they'd met. "She's sharp." Even when she was born, she didn't cry right away, just stared, like she already knew what the world was. Wade looked past them, out toward the open slope. "You ever think about what you'd do if you had a place of your own?" Her fingers paused at Vera's cheek. "Depends where it was. High enough to see snow on the peaks come October. Water runs year-round. There's a dry barn with room for chickens, maybe a milk cow if you're lucky. And the roof," she asked, "doesn't leak." Selah smiled down at Vera. Then maybe I'd grow squash, keep bees. Teach this one how to read. You know your letters. Used to help the preacher's wife copy hymns, back in Arkansas, before. She didn't explain what had happened after, and Wade didn't ask. Instead, he stood and walked to the line where the shade ended. He pulled a small flask from his coat and poured a measure of water into a tin bowl for Vera. When he turned, Selah was watching him, not guarded but curious, like she was trying to understand something she hadn't seen before. "Why'd you come west?" she asked. Wade turned the flask in his hands. "After the war, there wasn't much left back home. Just broken fences and too many graves. Figured I'd find something cleaner out here." She nodded slowly. "Did you?" "I found space," he said. "Not always clean, but quieter." The wind picked up a little, rustling the tall grass above the bluff. Selah reached over and touched his wrist where the skin was sun-browned and scarred near the cuff. Most men would have looked the other way. He didn't pull back. "Not the kind of man I aim to be." Vera let out a soft breath and dozed again. Selah eased her down and sat beside Wade, close enough their shoulders brushed. "Jackson's a long ride still," she said. "We'll take it slow." She looked out toward the ridgeline where the sun was starting to tilt west. "That's fine. I don't mind slow." Wade glanced at her, then nodded once. "Neither do I." They stayed there until the light turned gold across the rocks and the baby stirred again, reaching blindly. Selah stroked Vera's back, and Wade, without thinking, reached into his coat and handed her a clean square of cloth he'd kept tucked away. Selah took it and looked at him, quiet. "I never got to choose much," she said. "But I'm choosing this." Wade said nothing, but his hand remained beside hers in the grass until the sun dropped below the hill. When they rode on that evening, they did not speak, but they did not ride apart. They came upon an old trapper's cabin 3 days west of Bitter Creek, where the land turned greener with each mile and the air picked up the scent of pine. The cabin sat back from the trail, half sunk into a rise, with a sod roof and a rusted stovepipe leaning tiredly against the sky. No smoke came from the chimney, and grass had grown up thick around the door. Wade stepped down first, reins in hand, and studied the place. "Looks empty." Selah watched from the saddle, Vera curled against her shoulder, thumb tucked in her mouth. "You think we can stay long enough to rest," he said, already moving toward the door. "If it's sound." The door creaked open under his hand. Inside, dust blanketed the floor and a pile of dry mice bones lay in the corner, but the walls were solid and the roof held. He stepped back out and nodded. Selah dismounted carefully. "I'd like to boil water, wash my hair." "There's a spring downhill," Wade said, pointing past the trees. "I'll carry what you need." She didn't speak, but her eyes softened. That evening, while a pot of beans simmered on the small iron stove Wade had coaxed to life, Selah returned from the spring with her hair damp and braided, skin clean and flushed from scrubbing. She set Vera on a folded blanket near the hearth and knelt to dry her feet beside the fire. "This will do," she said, glancing around the one-room space. "Better than the back of a wagon." Wade handed her a tin plate, their fingers brushing. "We'll stay 2 nights. Let the horse rest." She accepted the plate, then looked at him across the firelight. "You trust me to stay?" "I do." She shifted, drawing her knees up. "Most men I've known, they don't trust a woman to do much more than fetch or keep quiet. I've seen what you've done since we left." He stabbed a piece of biscuit with his knife. "You keep moving, you keep that baby fed, and you don't complain. That's more than most." Selah looked down, brushing a crumb from her lap. "I used to think if I just endured enough, kept still, I'd be safe." Wade leaned forward. "That ain't the same as living." "No," she said, voice low. "It's not." They ate in silence for a while, fire snapping between them. Vera stirred but didn't wake. When Selah rose to tuck a blanket tighter around her, Wade watched how her movements were deliberate now, not rushed. There was steadiness in her hands. Later, Wade stepped outside to check the sky. The moon was rising clear, casting a pale glow over the trees. When he turned, he saw Selah standing in the doorway, arms folded, eyes on the stars. "You miss Arkansas?" he asked quietly. She leaned against the frame. "I miss the sound of crickets in summer. I miss my sisters singing." Wade nodded slowly. "I miss the smell of black earth after rain. Back east, it gets thick, it clings to your boots." Selah tilted her head. "You ever think of going back?" "Sometimes," he said, "but nothing's there now. Just graves and memory." She stepped out beside him, arms still folded. "I've lived too long being someone else's burden. I want land of my own, a fence I built, a door no one can bolt but me." "You'll have it," Wade said. "If you want it, you will." She turned to him then, close enough he could see the curve of her jaw in the moonlight. "Do you want company on that land of yours?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "I do." She didn't smile. She just reached out quietly and slid her hand into his. Inside, Vera let out a soft sigh in her sleep. The night was still, the kind of quiet that settled deep in the lungs like peace. Selah didn't let go. Wade didn't move, and for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. The wind shifted 2 days later, carrying the scent of pine pitch and distant rain. Wade stood at the edge of the clearing near the cabin, sharpening his knife against a leather strap, while Selah hung laundry across a line strung between 2 lodge poles. Vera lay on a thick quilt in the grass, gnawing on a wooden button Wade had carved from a broken drawer pull. Selah stretched a damp chemise between her hands, then glanced at Wade. "That storm will reach us by nightfall." He nodded without looking up. "We'll patch the north side of the roof before it does." She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward him, boots soft in the grass. "I checked the pantry. There's a sack of oats and a jar of dried apples someone left behind." "Still good, far as I can tell." Wade sheathed the knife and straightened. "We'll make porridge in the morning. Might be a while before we find another store." Selah studied his face a moment. "You always work ahead like that, thinking 2 days out. Had to learn. Winters come hard up here. You get careless, you don't last." She stepped closer, folding her arms. "You ever live with anyone before?" "Not since I was a boy." Selah tilted her head slightly. "You're easy to be quiet with." Wade's eyes met hers. "You don't need to fill the space, Selah. You just need to be." She gave a small nod and looked past him toward the ridgeline. "When I was kept, before Bitter Creek, there was a woman, older. She tried to help me, slipped me bread at night, shared a coat when the cold came. One morning she was gone, just gone." Wade waited. "I still don't know if they moved her or buried her." He didn't touch her, only stood steady at her side. "You carry her with you." Selah turned back to him. "I want Vera to grow up knowing what it means to stand tall, to speak and not be punished for it." "She will," Wade said. "She's got your backbone." A flicker passed through her expression, quiet and quick. "You trust easy, considering what the world's like." "I don't," he said, "but I trust you." Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from how simply he'd said it. Behind them, Vera let out a wail, sudden and strong. Selah turned fast, but Wade was already kneeling, lifting the child gently from the quilt. She reached for him, face scrunched and red, and he held her close, bouncing her lightly. Selah stepped over, hands out. "She's hungry." Wade passed her over carefully. "She's got lungs on her." Selah settled down against the old stump near the fire ring and began to nurse Vera, eyes half on the clouds building in the west. "You always this calm?" "No," Wade said. "But I've had to practice." She looked up at him again. "You think we'll make it?" "Make what?" "A life. Not just a living." Wade crouched beside her, elbows on his knees. "You keep putting one foot in front of the other, you build something. Doesn't matter how small it starts." Selah looked down at Vera, whose eyes had begun to flutter shut again. I want a table with 4 chairs and a garden full of things that take time to grow. You'll have them." She glanced sideways at him. "You say that like it's already true. It will be. If we make it so." Wade stood and walked back to the cabin, returning with a strip of canvas and a hammer. He climbed the lean side of the roof and worked as the wind picked up, sealing the worst of the gaps while Selah laid Vera down in her cradle box and began sewing a new bonnet from a faded scrap of blue muslin. By nightfall, the storm came low and slow, tapping the roof like a drum. Inside, the fire crackled warm and the smell of sage from the hearthstone filled the air. Selah sat on the floor, her back against the wall, needle paused in her hand. "If I stayed, past Jackson, past the next river, if I stayed with you." "What would you want?" Wade sat across from her, legs stretched long, hands folded. "Not more than you're willing." She held his gaze. "And if I'm willing—" He didn't move, but his voice went low. "Then I'd want to wake up next to you every morning. I'd want to build that table with you. Shape the legs, stain the boards. I want to hear your voice before the sun comes up." Selah set the needle down, her hands stilling in her lap. "That's the kind of wanting I could live with." Neither of them smiled, but something passed between them, quiet and whole. When the fire burned low and Vera stirred, Wade rose and added one more log. Then he crossed the room, knelt beside Selah and took her hand with care. She didn't speak. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in all her wandering she let herself rest. Outside, the storm passed. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and inside the cabin, where the wind no longer reached, the future began to settle its roots. The path into Jackson took them 6 more days, slow with the weight of new things, tools Wade bartered for in a logging camp, cloth Selah traded a tin of dried apples for, and Vera, who had begun to teethe and fuss in the evenings until Selah found a strip of leather for her to chew. The mountains rose sharp and blue ahead, the air thinner, the trees taller and closer together. Wade's land sat 3 miles south of town, tucked against a slope where elk passed through in the fall and wild currants grew thick in spring. When they crossed the final bend and the cabin came into view, Selah reined in. The house was small, with a stone chimney and a porch that leaned slightly east. A split-rail fence bordered a patch of open ground, and a line of cottonwoods marked the edge of the stream. She looked back at Wade. He dismounted without speaking and turned to help her down. She stepped into the grass, Vera in her arms, and stared at the place like it might vanish if she looked too long. "This is yours," she said. He adjusted the saddle girth. "It's ours if you want it." She moved toward the porch slowly. The door creaked open on a room warm with old wood and the smell of sage and pine tar. There was a stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed tucked behind a muslin curtain. Dust lay on the floorboards, but nothing rotten or broken. On the windowsill, someone Wade, she guessed, had left a row of carved stones. Selah set Vera down on a quilt and turned to Wade, who stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "I've never had a key to anything," she said. He stepped forward and took a small iron key from his coat. "Now you do." She reached for it with steady fingers, then looked up at him. "There's work to do." "There is. I'll need lumber," she said. "A basin, a second chair. I'll cut what we can't trade for." Selah glanced around the room again. "We should make room for a cradle." Wade's mouth twitched into something close to a smile. "You planning to stay?" "I already have." That night, Wade sat by the fire while Selah rocked Vera in the corner. Outside, the wind turned cool, carrying scents of damp soil and pine needles. Selah hummed something low and steady, and Vera's eyelids grew heavy once the child was asleep. Selah came to sit beside Wade on the floor, her knees drawn beneath her skirt. "I want to plant chamomile," she said, "and early beans, maybe goosefoot." "There's room behind the shed," he said. Soil's soft there after the thaw. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I used to dream of land, but I never thought I'd find someone to share it with." He laced his fingers with hers. "You didn't find it, you built it." The fire popped and settled. Selah turned her face toward his, close but not hurried. "You want me as wife?" she asked, voice even, eyes steady. Wade looked at her like a man offered water after a long ride. "Yes, I want to marry you proper," she said. "Not for shelter, not for safety." "For love, then," he said. She nodded once. "For love." They were married by a traveling circuit preacher 3 weeks later, under the cottonwoods beside the stream. Selah wore a dress dyed pale with lye soap and stitched with blue thread at the cuffs. Vera sat on Wade's hip through the vows, yawning wide. Afterward, they cooked beans and cornbread over the fire and passed a flask between them. No neighbors came they hadn't asked. It was enough. Through the summer, they planted and built. Wade added a second room to the cabin, and Selah lined the shelves with jars of wild chokecherry jam. Vera grew sturdy-legged and quick to laugh, toddling between their boots with a wooden spoon in each hand. By the end of the harvest, the fence stood whole and strong. The garden yielded squash and late beans. Selah traded jam and dried herbs in town for a bolt of calico and a new kettle. Wade dug a root cellar and built a gate that didn't sag. One night, as the first snow dusted the porch, Selah sat beside Wade with her feet tucked beneath a quilt. Vera slept in the new cradle Wade had carved, and the fire glowed quiet in the stone hearth. "I was thinking," Selah said, holding a mug of boiled chicory, "we could teach her letters come spring. She's young still. She watches everything. She'll be ready." Wade nodded. "We'll start with her name." Selah smiled, eyes full. "And when she's older, we'll tell her how she came to this place. How we all did." Wade leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, then her cheek, then her mouth. "She'll know," he said, "because she'll see it every day." Selah leaned into him, her hand on his chest, heartbeat steady beneath her palm. They stayed there in the quiet and warmth as the snow fell soft outside. And when morning came, the world was white and whole, and everything they'd built stood strong beneath the weight of it.